Hello, friends. This is Jim with Science Talk, and I want to discuss with you some pretty dire news here. If the nations are to fulfill the pledge of Paris of 2015, the climate cuts need to be tripled. So the gap between the world's greenhouse gas emissions and countries' planned reductions is growing, and only triple climate cuts can reduce the global warming enough. In other words, the two lines are not going to meet. They're going in opposite directions. Or one has a higher slope than the other, and the greenhouse gas emission is the one with the higher slope. So the cut is not going to catch up. That's basically what this is the essence of what I'm going to share with you. The emissions gap. This is the difference between the global emissions of greenhouse gases that scientists expect in 2030 and the level they need to be at to keep on pace with the promises to cuts in the greenhouse gas emissions. Right? This gap is the largest ever. So the gap between what was agreed at Paris in 2015 and the actual global emissions of greenhouse gases we're expected to be by 2030 is at the highest it's ever been recorded at, and appears to be even widening further. So it's definitely not good. And remember, the IPCC just released a report saying if we don't do anything by 2030, it's game over, humanity is screwed. And for the IPCC to issue such a dire prognosis when they're notoriously are underestimating things left and right, indicates that the situation is probably far worse than we even know. The 2018 Emissions Gap Report is published by the UN Environment Program, UNEP. While it is still possible to keep global warming below 2 degrees C, its authors say the world's current pace of action to cut emissions must triple for that to happen, and right now it is not doing that. It is not. The GAP report spells out in detail a criticism scientists have been making since soon after the agreement was reached, i.e. 2015 Paris, saying the current pace of countries' plans for reducing emissions, which they decide for themselves, is not enough to meet the Paris targets. Throw in the new IPCC report, and yeah, it's not good. The combination of increasing greenhouse gas emissions and increasingly inadequate action to slow them means that the emissions gap is bigger than it's ever been, and if we leave the business as usual, it will grow even larger and larger. Meeting the 2 degrees C target will require climate action efforts to triple, the GAP report says, but to meet the 1.5 degrees C limit, which many government scientists are urging, needs nations not just to triple their efforts, but to increase them five-fold. And we're already at 1.3. Current action to limit emissions suggests that global warming will reach about 3 degrees C above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century and will continue to rise after that. If the gap is not closed by 2030, the report authors say, it is highly unlikely that the 2 degrees C target can ever be reached. Ties into the IPCC report. So basically, this is going to get warmer and warmer and warmer. Now, of course, there's the caveat that I discussed in one of my videos some time ago, where I talked about how warming can lead to an ice age, because if you continue to melt Greenland, you shut down the Atlantic meridional overturn circulation. I did a whole bunch of video series on that. Please check those videos out. The issue is, I've stated then, I state now, is what is the thermal inertia in the system like? Will it be enough to offset that or not? That is an unknown. In 2017, global emissions rose again after a 3-year decrease as country efforts to combat climate change fell short of what was necessary for global emissions to peak. That year, global emissions reached 53.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, highest levels yet recorded. Now, the abbreviation is capital G, small case t, CO2, small case e. So whenever you see that GTCO2e, that is gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So what is a gigaton? A gigaton is 1,000 million tons. That's what it is. So we have a critical decade facing us. Two of the contributors are researchers from the IIASA, based in Luxembourg, Austria, Jerry Rogel and Daniel Huckman. Now, the IIASA is the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Basically, they do a lot of modeling, a lot of physics and chemistry, and just take all the scientific studies that are done, and they kind of crunch them all together. This year's report shows with renewed urgency that emissions reductions in the next decade are critical and that there are readily available options to achieve this. This is a statement by Dr. Rogel. He is the lead author of the chapter that updated the assessment of the emissions gap, which found that little or no progress has been made in the past year on new policies or more ambitious pledges. Dr. Huffman led the year-long effort to compile a large database of emission scenarios through the IIASA Scenario Explorer. The 2018 Emissions Gap Report draws from this database, and this database was first published in the journal Nature Climate Change. So, how do we close this gap if possible? The report outlines a roadmap by which this can happen, which meet the Paris Agreement targets and close the emissions gap by 2030. It includes possible contributions by government fiscal policy, the pace of innovation, and a review of climate action by groups other than governments. If they make commitments to the strongest climate action globally, the authors say emissions could be cut by 19 gigatons carbon dioxide equivalent, which is enough to close the 2 degrees C gap. Governments could subsidize low-emission alternatives, impose higher taxes on fossil fuels. If a carbon price of $70 a ton were adopted, emissions could be cut by 40% in some countries. Removing fossil fuel subsidies would cut global emissions by 10% by 2030, compared with a situation where no climate policies were imposed. If the IPCC report represented a global fire alarm, this report is the arson investigation, said UN Environment's Deputy Executive Director Joyce Masuya. The science is clear. For all the ambitious climate action we've seen, governments need to move faster and with greater urgency. We're feeding this fire while the means to extinguish it are within reach, she concluded. Now, it comes down to, as scientists, we do the studies, we do the analysis, we take work with the data, we present our findings, we present our recommendations. It is still left to the politicians to implement policies that address our recommendations and findings. They have to have the guts to do so. It comes down to them. They have to say we trust the scientists are correct, we need to follow their recommendations and implement their suggestions. Do they have the political will? So far, we're not really seeing that. A couple isolated cases here and there, some isolated countries here and there. Bolivia comes to mind off the top of my head. But scientists, especially in like the U.S., Canada, other places across Western Europe and so on, China, although China's kind of having a dichotomy here. They're reducing emissions in China, but they're helping build coal plants in Africa. So what's the net sum game on that? What's that about? So we need politicians to have the guts to implement wide-ranging policies to cut down emissions, go and implement, become aggressive with advancing green technology. So, wanted to bring you that report. Thank you for your time, and we'll talk soon. Hey folks, this is Jim here reminding you to subscribe to this channel, to share my videos, tell others of the work that I do here. I also ask that if you are not already a patron at Patreon, to please consider becoming a patron at Patreon. You can find the information in the description box below the video. I'm asking you to help support the work that I do. I do not take any money from corporations or from any other sources, so the information I share with you is the actual science as it comes out of the peer-reviewed journals. So there is no BS, there's no propaganda, there's no agenda. It's just I present the science and I explain to you what it means, or at least my interpretations of it, based on my own experience as a scientist. I want this channel to grow. I consider, while I discuss many different topics here, you notice I do focus a lot on climate issues. I consider climate change to be the most pressing issue facing humanity today. Thus, I consider it important to disseminate this information to a wider and wider, more and more people. And I need your help to do this. So, yes, please subscribe. Please tell others of the work that I do here. Please share my videos on social media platforms, with your social media groups, what have you. We need to get this information out there. So for those of you who are supporting me on Patreon, I thank you greatly for your support and continued support. It does mean a lot to me. So together we can get this information to more and more people. Thank you. Thank you for your support.